Good. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming out today. My name is Robert Pope. I'm a consultant here at STG. And today, the presentation is going to be on web accessibility. My goal today is to kind of get an intro into what accessibility is, why it's important for us to make websites that are accessible, and then I'm going to dive in a little bit to some technical details of how we can make our websites more accessible and some common errors that I've seen, and just kind of some things that I've learned in the last little while that have helped open my eyes and helped me understand the importance of web accessibility and how we can make that better for people with disabilities. So to start out, I just want to do a really brief intro of what is web accessibility. And a definition that I found that I liked is it means that websites, tools, and technologies that are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And a lot of times when we think of web accessibility, we think of accessibility in general. We think of like wheelchair ramps, stuff like that, or doors that automatically open. Things like that make the world around us, the physical world that we live in, more accessible for people with disabilities. And the web is similar in a lot of ways. There are technologies and things that can be built into our websites that can make the web more accessible for people with disabilities. And so with that in mind, these are just a couple of different types of disabilities. And these are ones that I specifically picked that might affect someone's usage of the internet, of websites. So there are short-term disabilities. You might break your arm. There are things like that that might make it difficult for you to use a website right now, but it might not be in a week or two or in the future. There's also long-term disabilities, whether it be permanent vision loss, hearing, motor, or cognitive disabilities. These all can have a dramatic impact on the way that people use websites. And there's also some situational, I don't know if they're quite disabilities, but they affect the way that we use the web. If you're holding a baby, it's going to be harder to use the website, so you might use it differently than you would if you're able to sit down with a monitor, keyboard, mouse. There's different ways that we might use the web. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here, is there's different ways that people use the web, and how we use it isn't necessarily how our users are going to be using it.
Robert?
Yes?
Can you explain more on cognitive? That seems like something you couldn't overcome with the website.
Yeah, so there's different types of cognitive disabilities. In general, something that to keep in mind is keep your website simple. Could help with that. So if I have a hard time understanding a giant complicated form perhaps could be an accessibility issue. That might fall into that issue. And so that's one area that, yes?
One thing talking about consistency. So let's say close button here, cancel button there, don't be little.
Yeah, and if you're going along with consistency, if your headers has your links laid out in a certain way and then it changes based on which page you're on, that's going to confuse people with different disabilities as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind with cognitive. Yeah. And then actually something I wanted to touch on a little bit with this. So a lot of times with accessibility we think of, oh, I need to make my website accessible, so I'm going to put an alt tag on an image and that's good. And while that's important, that's just one little part of accessibility. So like vision is something on here, which an alt tag will help with that, and some of these other ones as well. But hearing, you can imagine that if I had hearing difficulties, or if I completely could not hear at all, it would be difficult there are parts of the web that would be difficult, like audio, videos that have audio in them. Those things, it's important to keep that in mind as far as that goes. With motor disabilities, the way the traditional, lots of times we use the web, is with a keyboard and a mouse. And you can imagine if you had limited mobility with your hands, with your arms, that is going to make that difficult. And so with all of these, there are things that are called assistive technologies that can help people use your website. So with vision, there's screen readers, which will read the text to someone who can't see it so that they can hear it. For someone who can't hear, you might have transcripts for your video so that they can read it. There's also things called braille readers, which will actually take the content from your website and output it on a braille device as they're going along. And so they can go along and use your website. Even if someone couldn't hear or see, if you build your website accessibly, they can use your website with a braille device as well. It's another option. And so it's important to keep in mind there are lots of different assistive technologies and different ways that people might consume our websites. And so kind of going along with that, why is it important? Why is web accessibility important? Why should we spend the time to learn about this, to implement it? And there's a lot of different reasons. And right here I threw a bunch of stats on this slide from the US Census. And this is just people reporting different disabilities that they have. And a lot of these definitely affect the usage of websites. And so just kind of a couple of these things that I think are kind of stood out to me is, I mean, there's 55 million people in the US that reported having a severe disability, which I don't remember exactly how many people in the US, but it's something like 300 something million, so that's a pretty high percentage of people. There are about 24 million people need assistance getting in or out of a bed or chair due to a long-lasting condition. 5.1% of adults have difficulty seeing. So, and there's 1.6 million blind people in the US as well. So I've talked to some people about web accessibility, and they've wondered, like, I mean, how many people actually need stuff like this? And I think this is important to realize. There's a lot of people that need this. And so that's why I'm putting I think looking at the stats is a little bit eye-opening, that there are a lot of people that can benefit from this. And then there's a lot of hearing difficulties as well, 3.4 million deaf. And then functional limitations like motor difficulties. 5.2% of adults are unable to do certain tasks, such as just certain tasks with the upper body movement is very limited for a huge percentage of people as well, which is going to limit the way that they use the website if you can't do everything with your arms, with your hands, picking things up, fine motor skills like clicking on a mouse, typing on a keyboard, things like that can severely impact the way that people use websites as well. And then just a couple little more stats. WebAIM is an organization that's actually in Utah. They're up in Utah State University. They're a part of the Center with Persons with Disabilities up there. And they're often seen as some of the leaders in web accessibility in the world. If you are researching about web accessibility, their name will come up a lot. I've been reading up from courses by Google, and they'll quote WebAIM all over the place. And so I like a lot of what WebAIM does, and so I'll reference them a few times throughout this presentation, because I think they do a lot of good work on this and have a lot of good information out there. And so they say that conservative statistics indicate that at least 8.5% of the population has a disability that would affect internet use. And so they say that's a conservative estimate because it's really hard to get an accurate estimate of exactly how many people does this affect, just due to the nature of reporting and all of that. But it's a lot of people, and that's kind of what it boils down to. There's a lot of people that this affects. And one thing to consider as well is, as populations age, as people age, the chances of having a disability are going to increase exponentially as well. Because as you get older, your hearing goes down, your eyesight goes down, your control of your motor abilities, that goes down. And so this is something that could affect any one of us at some point of our lives as well. And then I believe it's the right thing to do. So that's another reason why should we worry about this. I think it's important to not exclude people. And the internet I like to think of it as the internet is accessible by default, and if we just build our web pages in the correct way, then people will have so many opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't be able to have. And if you kind of think about it, like 50 years ago, 100 years ago, somebody who had some severe disabilities would be a lot more limited than what they are today. Today, if we have accessible websites out there, somebody could, from their house, they could order groceries, they could turn on and off their lights, their heating system. They could do all sorts of things that they wouldn't have been able to do in the past. And so the internet has opened up so many opportunities, but if our content isn't accessible, then it's useless for people who really need it. And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind there. And there's a YouTube video, we're not going to watch it, but I thought it was insightful to just learn more about people who have disabilities and how they interact with the world. And something that someone named Jeff Parody said in one of these videos was, convenience for you is independence for us. So a lot of these cool things that are coming out today that are like, oh, it's cool, I can turn off my air conditioning from my phone. That's convenient. But imagine if you had limited abilities, then that's going to be independence for you. Instead of having to ask somebody to turn on the light for you, or to turn off the air conditioning, to order your groceries, instead of asking somebody to do that and relying on somebody else, you now are able to be independent and do that on your own. And I think that is huge. I think it's important to realize how important independence can be for anybody. And so that's another reason why I think this is critical to keep accessibility in mind. Then there's also the legal side of it. It's kind of a mess. There's just a lot going on, not a lot of clarity in the US, especially. There's not like a law out there that says every website has to meet these criteria to be accessible. There are some laws for government agencies, agencies that receive government funding. There are laws called Section 504 or 508 that apply to that type of thing. And so that's pretty clear. If it's the federal government, their websites need to be accessible by law. And then, but in the general public, it's a little bit more up in the air. So in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act came out, and that said that you can't discriminate against people based on disabilities. And along with that came a lot of things like wheelchair ramps and access to the physical world for people with disabilities. And pretty much the web as we know it came after that act came out. But a lot is kind of up in the air, like, does that act apply to every single website? And so there's been some debate and back and forth on that. And there is no, like I said, there's no clear law in that, so we're kind of up to interpretation by the judicial system at this point, because some companies have been getting sued for having inaccessible websites, and so because there are no laws, it's been a little bit, the judges have been kind of determining, does this law apply, does the American with Disabilities Act apply to the website as well? And in some cases they are ruling that it has, in a lot of cases people are settling. It's kind of the Wild West a little bit with web accessibility and legal issues. I think personally the most important thing to think about with this is, I mean, there could be issues, and it's important to make it accessible so that you don't have issues there. And so that's just another reason to bring up to people that we work with that it's important to make it accessible, everything that we do. There's also, I mean, the US has kind of that going on. There's also a lot of global laws out there. Canada has a lot more specific web accessibility laws. The European Union has come out with some directives for web accessibility. So any companies that want to be international, that's another thing to keep in mind with legal issues. Some different countries have different requirements for web accessibility as well. And then something I wanted to mention, WebAIM came out with a project recently. They call it the WebAIM Million, where they basically went through and scanned the million most popular websites in the world for web accessibility issues, and they scanned the homepage of these websites just to see what's the state of web accessibility for the most popular websites in the world, and it's not good. On average, there's almost 60 errors per page for web accessibility errors. And these are just detectable errors. Yes?
The litigation, are they litigating to change things, or is there a pot of gold to take?
I'm not 100% sure on that. I know there's definitely a lot of people out there that want that the litigation is for changing things. I do know a lot of communities that like I'm part of like a web accessibility Slack channel. A lot of people talk about some of this stuff, and a lot of the consensus that there are some people that are just going after, hey, let's go sue people. There is some of that for sure, and then there are some that are just like, hey, you need to fix this website so that people can use it. So I think there's some of both of that going on.
Are the settlements small or company?
So the ones that I've personally seen have been a lot of bigger companies like Target, Amazon, Netflix. A lot of those companies have had some of the accessibility lawsuits going against them, and some of those have been big. Some of the settlements have been, part of the settlement is you can't disclose what the settlement was, so we don't really know, and so there is some of that as well where I don't know. So I don't know too much on that answer, but I do think it is important to keep that in mind as well. So yeah. So I think just kind of going along with all of this, the state of the web is kind of in an interesting place. It's pretty new compared to most things. It's pretty new technology, and there's not a lot of good guidelines out. There's good guidelines, but there's not a lot of good laws out there that say this is what you have to do and this is what you risk if you don't. And so I think it's important to just realize that, hey, this is an issue and we can fix it. And so I think that's what I'm going to focus on mostly today is how can we make this better? Because it's in a pretty bad spot right now as far as accessibility. So that's kind of a bit of the why we should care, and I want to jump into a little bit of what we can do about it, kind of a little bit more of the technical aspects of this. So the World Wide Web Consortium has come out with some guidelines called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and these are the most often referenced web accessibility guidelines out there for what you need to do to make your website accessible. And so it's really a whole lot of guidelines that they have put out there of things that your website should do or should not do in order to be an accessible website. And most laws that are existing, like even like Section 508 and of the U.S. government laws, will reference these guidelines. And so these are, WCAG isn't a law, but there are guidelines out there that laws often reference to help you realize whether your website is accessible or not. And then there's a couple different versions of WCAG. 2.1 came out in like 2008, so it's kind of an older version. And you can imagine with the coming out of mobile phones, how that has exploded in the last 10 years or so. They did an update just last year and addressed some issues with mobile phones as well, and some other areas as well. 2.1 doesn't change anything in 2.0, but it adds some extra requirements. And then with WCAG, there's 3 layers of accessibility. There's A, AA, and then AAA. A is kind of the bare minimum, and then AA includes everything in A, but adds some extra requirements on top of that. And then AAA is, I kind of think that is like some icing on the cake, because it's impossible to make your website AAA compliant pretty much always, because there's so many different guidelines that can be very specific to certain use cases that you might not be able to do in every website. And so even I found on the World Wide Web Consortium's website, they said it's not recommended that you say like our website tries to follow AAA accessibility, just because it's almost impossible. The thing to keep in mind with AAA is there are a lot of things in there that are really good for accessibility, so it's good to know what is in there and then apply them when you can. And then there's some things that you can't always apply there. So it's kind of a lot of technical things kind of thrown out there. In a minute, I'll try to get to some demos of showing what some more what things are that can be bad for accessibility. Last thing with WCAG is they have this acronym for, and that's just to help you remember just some general guidelines for web accessibility, and that stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So those are the 4 categories that every website should have in order to be accessible. Perceivable kind of goes along with, can people consume your content? So, and there's different ways that people consume your content, like we mentioned a little bit earlier. So making sure your website can be perceived by someone with vision, someone without vision, someone who has hearing problems, someone with motor disabilities. Can people perceive this content in different ways through the different senses, and not just one sense only? Operable, kind of going along with that, can I use your website? Often as we build a website, we might test it with a mouse, maybe a keyboard a little bit, but that's not the only way that people might use a website, so it's important to understand, does my website work for different people as well? And then there's understandable. Some things that go along with that is setting like the language in your website. If you don't, screen readers or assistive technologies might have a difficult time understanding, displaying that content to your users. So just making sure your content is understandable, and then robust as well. Does it work across different platforms, or is it only in this specific use case that you thought of when testing, it has the only time that it works? It's important to make sure that what you build is flexible enough to work for different cases as well. So now that we're over some of that technical jargon, I guess, how do we test this as developers, as whatever our role is in web accessibility? How do we make sure our websites are accessible? And one of the first things that I would recommend is, can you use your website with a keyboard only, or do you have to use a mouse? If you have to use a mouse, then it's probably not accessible. Because a lot of assistive technologies will use similar interfaces to the keyboard or the mouse. And so if you make your website accessible to the keyboard only and to the mouse only, then there's a good chance that you're going to not be falling into a lot of the common errors. So that's something I would recommend with everything that we do as web professionals, is test your website with the keyboard only. And so can you fill out every form? Can you visit links? Can you click on every button? Can you go through the entire website with the keyboard only? Another way is a screen reader. I hope to be able to do a little bit of a demo here of what a screen reader is like. So that is an important way to test, because there's a lot of things that we don't think about as we're testing and building a website, that if you test it with a screen reader, it becomes pretty obvious some common accessibility issues. Then there's some browser extensions out there that can help you test for some of the common errors as well. And I'm going to pull up here some of this. So one of these is called Wave, and that's built by WebAIM, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. And basically, the nice thing about some of these extensions is you can, in your development environment, even if it's not in production yet, you can run a lot of these tests to see how accessible your website is. So you just click that button and it pulls over here this side menu where it lists how many errors you have, which errors are things that are just wrong. It's bad for accessibility, you didn't do things correctly. And if you click here, it'll kind of show you what they are. So if you're missing alternative text in an image, that's not accessible. If you're missing a form label, that's not accessible. You have an empty button as well, empty links. Then you can see here there's alerts, where this kind of gets into an area where automated tests can't detect all errors. You really need somebody to go through and test for this as well manually. Some of these alerts can help you test that way though. It kind of brings up some common issues that might be an issue, but you really need to test to see if it really is an issue. That's what those errors are. And then there's a lot of extra features that this will help you out with as you're testing for accessibility. You can see your web page with no styles, because sometimes styles, we can make things that look right, but is the HTML actually accessible? So if you strip out those styles, what does it look like? So that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind as well. And then contrast issues. You can see this page has a lot of contrast issues where maybe someone who has low vision might not be able to see some of the content on these pages. And so that's another thing to keep in mind as well, is contrast. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on each specific tool, but I just want it to be clear there's a lot of these tools out there that do similar things to this. Right in Chrome, there's something called Lighthouse that you can use to inspect, and actually I will just kind of show what that is. If you come over here to audits in Chrome, you can see there's an accessibility audit. You can just run that on your website, and then it'll kind of go through and show you, like, here's some issues. It even gives you like a nice little score. It's 57 out of 100, and so that's another built into Chrome thing that you can use as well.
Is that essentially telling the same kind of thing as the way through was?
Yep, same types of things. Some of them, a lot of these tools have a little bit different methodologies, different ways to display it, but they're the same types of things where you have alt text, you have a lot of the testable accessibility issues that can be automatically tested, can be automated, are what these tools are going for. And then the other one I wanted to touch on a little bit, and this one's a lot newer, actually I don't want to open that, is Microsoft came out with one called Accessibility Insights for Web. And it has a couple of nice features that I thought can come in handy when you're testing a website. So one thing, right here, if you turn this on, it'll just show you all the automated errors that they were able to detect. So kind of like the WebAIM tool, where it just highlights, hey, this is an issue, you can click on it, read more, understand why it's an issue, stuff like that. They also have a color mode, where basically it takes the color out of your website, because you can't rely on color alone for important information. And if you do, then it might be inaccessible to somebody who doesn't see color, or for a tool who doesn't interpret color, like a screen reader. If you're using a website through a screen reader, color means nothing, or you're colorblind, color might not be a reliable way to convey information. So that's another handy tool. It just kind of takes the color out to make sure, hey, does this still make sense without color in? Another important thing with accessibility is your heading structure. A lot of times developers will use headings as styles. They're like, oh, I want something styled like this, I'm going to make it an H1. I want it styled like this, I want to make it an H3, and just kind of go all over the place with the headings. That can be an issue because headings are another way that people can navigate through your website. So someone with an assistive technology might jump from heading 1 to heading 2 to heading 3 just to be able to quickly go through your website. Because you can imagine having to read the entire website every single time would be a big pain. So a lot of times when I go to a website, I'll click on it and I'll start scrolling through it and just skim it to see, okay, what do I want to see, what do I not care about? Headings is an important way to make that distinction for everybody, I think. But with CSS, you can make something look like a heading that's not a heading, or you can make a heading look like it's not a heading. And so headings are used all over the place where they probably shouldn't be. So that's something to keep in mind. This kind of just shows you where are your headings, and kind of think of it like an outline. Your H1 is the topic of your entire page, H2 is a subtopic, and your H3s go under your H2s. You kind of have that nested hierarchy like that, kind of like a table of contents might have. And then landmarks are another thing that people can use to navigate through your website. You know, if you have, in HTML, you have the header landmark, you have main, the footer. There are a couple of different ones as well. This just shows where they are, and that's a way that someone might be able to navigate through your website with assistive technology. So the recommendation there would be to use those instead of just using like a div and make it look like this. You can actually just use the header HTML element, or the main HTML element, the footer HTML element, and that way people can just jump through your website quickly without running through the same content over and over again that they don't actually want to see.
So you just name up three, header, main, and
there's some others as well.
So, yeah, not in the but so where is there a resource somewhere that shows us, like, you know, which of those kind of tags should we be using?
Yeah. Yeah. So there are. Yeah. So the question is how. Yeah. So, yeah. So I'm going to try and repeat a little bit, because I keep forgetting what I'm supposed to be repeating for the mic. So basically your question was, is there a list of these landmarks that we can see to see what we should be using? And yeah, there are different resources. HTML5 came out with a lot of these different landmark regions that you can use. And so I don't have a specific one, but there are definitely resources that will list some of these. And I would say probably the most important one would be like your navigation sections, where you have a ton of links for navigating through your site. It's important, but I might not want to hear that every time I navigate through your website. I might want to be able to skip that or stuff like that. So, and your main content is important, because maybe I just want to jump right there to the meat and bones of this page. Or the footer, maybe I know you have your privacy policy or whatever else is in your footer. I want to jump straight there. So stuff like that, just keeping that in mind would help with that. And the last one here. So along with keyboard accessibility, as you tab through a web page, it will jump from the focus of your web page from interactive elements. So see, if I tab here, I created the skip to main content link, which is a good recommendation as well for accessibility. For browsers and things that don't support the landmarks as well, like main or header or footer, it can be good to add the skip to main content or something like that. So that if I click that link, I jump straight to the main content, so I don't have to go through the entire process. But this tab stop feature, which it looks like I turned it off, basically just shows you where the focus is going as you tab through the web page. And you want to make sure that this makes sense, because if the order of this doesn't make sense, your website's probably not very accessible, because this is how a lot of people are going to interact with your site. So this is just another tool to, and as you see here, I created some buttons that aren't really buttons. They look like buttons, but they're not focusable, so if I tab through it, it skips right past them. And so it can help highlight some of these issues like that, where, hey, this is an issue. So there's that. And then the last thing I wanted to show with this extension, I haven't used this one yet. I actually just saw it today, but I thought it was really cool. They have this little assessment feature that you can use, where basically it can help you go through your entire website and say, hey, does this pass, does this fail? And you can kind of give a report to somebody of these are the issues of accessibility issues that you might have. So if you click here on automated checks, we've already seen a lot of those with like the wave tool. This is just the automated test that it was able to do. But then this tool, what I like about it is it also has some manual tests, but it kind of walks you through it. So stuff like this. Users must be able to navigate all interactive interface components using a keyboard. And so then you come here, go through it, and it tells you how to test it. It gives you different ways you can do that. And then you say, does it pass, does it fail? So you say, hey, that passes. Come to this one, that one fails. This one passes. I think when it fails, you're supposed to put like some more details. And here you could put like, this block of code fails for this reason. Give some more details why. I'm just going to throw something in there right now. And then once you're done going through this manual audit, you could export the results, which then downloads an HTML document, which you could then give to somebody to help as you're running this HTML audit. So I think this is a pretty cool feature. I haven't used it yet. I've played around with it a little bit, but I thought it was a pretty cool way to help you either test it yourself to see where you're at on your website, or if you're working with somebody to help them show the issues that they have on their website. I think this tool will help a lot with that as well. So those are some of the extensions you can use. There's also some development integrations that you can, like for test automation type things, that you can run some of these same automated tests through your automated testing workflows. The one I'm most familiar with is called Axe. So basically, it's kind of like any of your automated tests. You see there's a line of code somewhere where basically they say insert calls at every point in your test where a new piece of UI becomes visible or exposed. So that way you can, if you have JavaScript adding stuff to your page, you don't want to just test at the beginning. You could test later on and then run some tests to make sure that it doesn't fail some of these common accessibility issues as well. So that's another way to test. There's some enterprise solutions out there that cost money where basically you can run some of these same types of tests, but over hundreds or thousands or millions of web pages and get reports of this is how many errors you have across everything. So if you ever have a need for that, those are out there for and they charge. And then, but the most important thing I think to keep in mind with these is they can only catch a small percentage of errors. So a lot of errors in accessibility need to be manually tested. Someone needs to manually test, like, hey, does this actually work? And it's just the nature of accessibility that it has to be manually tested. So if you pass these tests, it doesn't mean your website's accessible. It does help you get a better idea of where you're at and that you're not doing a lot of these common issues that can easily be prevented against. And I think I just wanted to make a note about ARIA. A lot of times as developers, we see ARIA as we're going through tutorials, as we're going to libraries like Bootstrap or whatever it might be. You see ARIA, you might copy and paste it, but never really touch it again. It's just kind of there. ARIA helps you tell the browser what different elements are. So the browser has like a select element, and we know that's a drop-down, and that if you use a select, then that's great. Assistive technologies know what a select is. They know how to present that to screen readers, to other assistive technology. If you create your own select, now there's some other issues. If you create like a div, you click on that div, it makes another div come up. Now you run into issues where the screen reader doesn't know that that's a select. And so ARIA was created to help kind of bridge some of that gap, to help you tell assistive technologies what your elements are. I think one of the most important things, like right on the ARIA specifications website, it says no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. And so that's important to keep in mind. Don't just like copy and paste it in there and then never test it or look at it again, because you can make the website less accessible by having bad ARIA in there. Because with ARIA it's really powerful, but you could tell screen readers that a checkbox is a button, or you could like do all sorts of weird things that could make your website really inaccessible really fast. And so it's important to understand what it is and make sure you're doing it right so that you don't make it worse by adding that in there. And then, so what I wanted to do now was I created this I threw together this demo site, and I just want to kind of go through some common accessibility issues that I've seen and show why it can be bad for accessibility and what we can do instead. And to start out, I'm going to try and pull up the screen reader just to kind of read this first part right here. So language is something that you don't think about a lot when you're creating a web page. In your HTML element, you can have language equals, and then you're supposed to put the language there that the main language of your website is. Sometimes it's easy to forget that. It doesn't seem all that important. Your website works fine without that. Sometimes it's not obvious why that's important. But I want to show a little bit of why that can be. It's a really easy thing to fix, but it can be pretty bad for accessibility if you don't. So I'm going to try and use a screen reader. I don't use a screen reader user in my day-to-day, so I might fumble through this a little bit. So I'm right here on this language header, and I'm going to have the screen reader read this section. And basically what I did here, I put English as the language for the entire HTML element of the document, but then I changed the language on some of these different paragraphs. And so you can kind of see if the language is wrong, how that can sound for somebody who's using a screen reader and how bad that can be. And kind of use case when this might happen. Say I know English and Spanish, so my default settings is English, but I might visit a web page in Spanish, and so if the web page doesn't have the language specified, it's just going to start going in my default. Which if a screen reader is reading English, but it's trying to do it with like a Spanish accent using the Spanish letters and words, it's not going to sound very good. And so that's what I want to demo right here.
Having level 2 language, use a screen reader to listen to the following text. It is important to set the context setting in order to operate the train rate in the text using the Chrome users. Spanish, imagine all my language, Spanish, no one can English, no language, it means very bien and Spanish, French, no hacen the English, digital and take 20 or
So you can kind of see that it's pretty bad. And something to keep in mind with screen readers, I have the settings for this pretty slow, but as people use screen readers a lot, they speed this. Actually, let me let me see if I can pull this up. So you see this rate right here. You can crank this up where I've seen people, like I've seen some videos of people using this. I don't know exactly how fast they were, but it was so fast I'm like, I can't even distinguish words in there. But people can train their brain to where they can understand that. And I can imagine that would be part of that might have been the language issue, but yeah. But yeah, for sure. And you can turn this way down and so that the screen reader is really slow as well. But you can imagine if the language is wrong and it's just trying to read really fast, it's going to be pretty much impossible to understand what those words are. And so I'm going to put this back down to as low as it goes. Actually, I think you can go lower if you take this out. So you can go really slow. Let me try to find it. Okay, that sounds more reasonable.
Is there a better screen reader?
So there are,
Which one is that?
this is called NVDA. NVDA.
NVDA.
Yeah, and so this one's a free one. It's an open source screen reader. Works best on Windows. There's one called JAWS that's actually the most popular screen reader. It's pretty much only used for Internet Explorer, unfortunately, or I guess Edge now. And it costs money as well, so it's a little bit harder to test with that one, unless you're going to invest some money into that as well to be able to test with that. Mac users have something called VoiceOver that it's just built into the operating system for iPhone and Mac as well, so you can use that one. So there are different options. This is one of the more popular ones because it's free. There are different voices in those settings that you can change, and I picked this one because, and actually maybe we can switch it to one of the other ones now. But I picked that one because of the other voices that sounded a little bit better couldn't change languages as well, and so that's why I picked that one, because I wanted to demo the language. But you can, you see right here, there's like
output device, Microsoft output device, synthesizer, combo not CC.
Maybe I'll just leave it for now. But you can change like the voice and some different settings, and there were some other ones that sounded a lot better. And so depending on people's needs or whatever, they might play with all of these settings and get something that sounds better, for sure. So yeah, so that's language. Basically, is put it there on your HTML document what the main language is. If you ever change language throughout your HTML document, put the language equals around that element so that any assistive technologies know that this block of text is a different language. That's really, it's pretty simple, but I think it's a pretty important thing to do. So as far as links go, it's normally recommended to not do links that are like click here, read more, stuff like that, because lots of users are going to use your web page, not just like reading from top to bottom. And let me see if I can pull up.
That's a good idea.
I think so. But yeah, a lot of things with accessibility you'll find are, if you make it more accessible, you're going to make it better for everybody, more usable. So they're just good ideas in general, but for accessibility issues, it can make it really hard to use your website if you don't do some of these things. So I pulled up the list right here that the screen reader has, and this is another way that someone might navigate your website. So right here's the list of all the links on this page. And so click here, visited, that really means nothing to me. If I want to navigate your web page, it's just click here, read more, read more. You can see if you're not right there in the context, it can be bad for accessibility. Other ways you can navigate through it through the heading. So you can see it's kind of like that.
So that people can, hear if they can see,
like Braille?
Yeah, that's for the blind people.
Yeah. So there are devices that are similar, but instead of reading it, they're basically I haven't actually seen one. I've seen pictures, but they're called like Braille output devices, where as you're reading text, like a screen reader might, but instead of reading it, it'll change the Braille display, and so then someone could go filling it. So there are definitely devices that can help with that as well.
Are they large enough to display graphs and pictures, or is it just text Braille?
I'm guessing it's just text. I don't know. I haven't used one, but yeah, graphs can be tricky as well if it's only visual. Because a lot of times, if you think of different graphs, you might have like a pie chart. What does that mean if you can't see it? So there are extra considerations to take in mind with graphs. One thing I have seen with graphs is providing an alternate table, because tables are an HTML element that are accessible to these assistive technologies where they can navigate through a table. So if you're able to convert your graph into a table as an alternative, you can keep the graph there, but have a table as well. That can be one way to handle some of those issues where it's like, this is a visual only thing, but the content is really important, so you don't want to exclude somebody who can't see. And so that is one extra thing there as well. So I think with all of this, the main point I want to get across is there's a lot of different ways that someone might navigate your website, so it's important not to make too many assumptions that mouse keyboard, scrolling down, that's not the only way to do this. You might navigate, see all the buttons, all the landmarks, and so I think that's the important part to remember there. There's a lot of different ways to do this, and so use semantic HTML, use headings, use links. You could make a div with a JavaScript that makes it act like a link, but unless you also add some ARIA to that, assistive technologies aren't going to know about it. And then you get into, well, why not just use a link to start out with? It just makes it a lot easier. Whenever you can, just use HTML elements. The default HTML elements are accessible by default. If you use them correctly, makes your website accessibility so much better. So there's that to keep in mind. So now I'm going to jump a little bit into forms. When we have forms, we've got our inputs, we have our labels, there's the buttons. A lot of times people don't put labels, or they don't associate labels with inputs. That can be bad for accessibility. So I'm going to tab into these here. So you hear that says edit blank. So you imagine if you can't see this, what am I editing? What am I doing? So, and the reason that's a problem is, sorry, that keeps going crazy in between things, but so I made a label, I made a div, and I gave it a class label so it could look like a label, but it's not a label and it's not associated with that input. And so when a screen reader or assistive technology user gets to that, it's just going to say, here's an input, you can edit it. And so that really, without the context around it, it's really impossible to really know exactly what's going on there. Here I put a placeholder in it, which isn't the recommended way of doing it, but I was curious to see, from a placeholder, would the screen reader be able to know what it is? And it looks like it is. I wouldn't necessarily rely on that, just because it's not what it was intended for. Screen readers might see, hey, lots of times people do this. If there's not a label, let's try and use a screen read placeholder just to be able to give our user something. But that's not really the most reliable way of doing things. The proper way is just adding a label and then
document HDOM 32 read more.
Sorry.
Less input. Menu done. Document HDOM 32 less input.
So right here you see there's a label and it has a for equals search, and the input has the ID of search. And that's the proper way of associating a label with an input. Then it's very clear. If I come here,
11 Y document.
Oops.
Search edit blank.
Now it says search edit blank. So now a screen reader user has all the same information that a visual user would have. This form input is associated with search.
Search edit color group select.
So here you notice it also did it. I created a label associated with the input and gave it a screen reader only class around the label. If you have to do that, that is one way to. So say you get a design and they say, oh, we don't want the label, we think it looks ugly or whatever. That is another way to get around that for assistive technologies, is basically you hide the label visually, but it's there. And
Can menu sub not search
so see here,
equals
isn't quite, there we go.
equals
It's going a little slow. So right here we have a screen reader only, which a lot of frameworks like CSS frameworks will come with a class to help you with it, like Bootstrap. I threw Bootstrap in here, and that's the Bootstrap class for screen reader only. And so this won't be displayed to the user, but screen reader will be able to. So that, you don't want to overuse that, but when it's necessary, that is available as well.
field set
Something else to keep in mind. So say you have like a group of form elements that are related. You want to make sure that you put those in a field set and have a legend for those.
slash link click here banner search color grouping red rated over not checked well high.
So you notice when I tabbed in here, it said color grouping, and then it said red checked 1 to 5. If I didn't have that legend, and if it didn't have these associated together, then it would just tell me, hey, here's a red input button, and it's checked. And that might be fine, but imagine you had a big form where it's like all the answers are yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. As you're navigating through those, if it's just like, yes, checked, next one, yes, checked, next one, yes, checked. That's not super helpful information. Whereas if you associated it with legend, like color, it would be like color, red, checked. And so that's where field sets and legend can come in handy. And that's something I didn't know about for a while. I didn't realize that was a thing, but it can help with accessibility as well.
So the word is color is one that is
Color menu
Yeah.
F2
legend.
Yep. And so this whole section is a field set.
11 why not
Color is the legend, and then everything else is just in that field set as well. So basically the legend is saying, this is the title for this group. It's kind of like the label for this group of labels almost, where this group of labels and inputs. So just having the legend inside the field set is how you would make that association there.
color
So then selects are another thing. I've heard a lot of people like, oh, I don't even like to use normal selects. I'll just build my own because it makes it look way better. It's possible, but there's a lot to consider other than, so if you see right here, I made an imposter select. It's just a div with another div, and I can click on it and it changes. So it kind of looks like it works, but there's a lot of issues with it. If I tab, it'll skip it always because it's not in the tab order because of the div. Divs aren't tabbable by default, so it skipped. That's something to keep in mind there. Other things to keep in mind, keyboard interactions. With the select, I should be able to hit like key, like F, and it will jump to the F's in the drop down. Or I should be able to hit escape to get back out. So if you're going to build your own select, there's a lot of things to keep in mind that you also would have to do. So normally I would say just use the normal select. If you absolutely have to, then realize there's a lot more to keep in mind than just being able to click on it and then click on the option you want. There's a lot of extra functionality you need to bake into that by default. So images are another thing. You should have an alt tag. If the image is 100% decorative, you could do alt equals blank. Don't do that unless it is just a decorative image and there's really no content that is important in this image. But if it's purely for the decoration of your website, then you can put alt equals blank, and that is the proper way of saying that this image has no content. Something to keep in mind with images that are links. Let's see if so you can tell that wasn't a very helpful, like, where is this link going to? This hamburger bun link, it just tried to read the part of the URL to me of where it's going because there's no text in this. I didn't put an alt image in it, so it's like, hey, here's a link and it's going here. So that's all the information that an assistive technology would have there. Whereas here, I put in an alt text, and so it's able to determine, hey, this is just like you would put text for your link, you should put that there as well. Font icons are similar, except they're not necessarily images. If you have to have a font icon without any text by it, you're going to want to adds like a screen reader only text by it so that a screen reader user knows what that's going to. Otherwise, there's literally no content here.
Visited link.
Here's a link. That's all a screen reader user would know.
Facebook visited link.
Here it put some screen reader only text so it knows it's Facebook.
Forms visited
Here it put
link.
some visual text so it's obviously very obvious where that's going. And then I'm going to skip through this a little bit. Just for lists and stuff, you should use a UL, OL, LI, just because as you're navigating through,
Having level 2 list. Having left list with 5 items for employment.
you can see how it says there's a list of 5 items. And that's very useful if I can't see this. If I'm browsing, do I want to get into that list? Okay, there's that list. Maybe I just want to skip it. It's important information to know. So it's important to keep things in their semantic lists as well. There's kind of buttons. I kind of already touched on this a little bit. This is a button. These other ones have the same functionality if I use the mouse, but if I use a keyboard, not so much. I can't really ever get to these. They're pretty much, they're just divs. The screen reader knows nothing about them. You can add ARIA to help with that. And adding a tab index to this makes it so it's tabbable as well. So this is a div, but makes it a little bit more usable. But again, it's kind of like, why just use a button instead of going through all that work of adding, like, hey, let's give it a role of a button and make it clickable and worry about all these other things. Instead, if you just use a button, the HTML standard will take care of that for you if you use the native elements. And then just kind of reiterating that. No ARIA is better than bad ARIA, so I'll just slap it in there and hope it works. If you're going to put ARIA, you should probably test it to make sure that it actually works. Color is another important thing. Don't rely on color alone. Bad contrast. This is obviously really bad contrast, but there's different levels of that. Bad contrast, it might be annoying for some people, but it might make your content unusable for other people as well. Another thing, so see there's these 2 buttons right here. This is kind of what, if you relied on color alone, it's like, click the green button to do this and the red button to do this. Well, if I don't see color, that means nothing to me. So don't ever rely on color alone for content. Color can be good to enhance, but you can't rely on that alone for content. Something with like single page application that comes up a lot is like dynamic content. Maybe do an AJAX request to go get some content. If you don't do something to let screen readers know about this, they'll never know that new content is there. So right here, I click this button. Okay, I click the button, and that's all I know. You can notice that once I clicked it, there's no notification that, hey, the content's here now. Something's changed.
Get content in library some text content.
But this one, I use some ARIA to tell it that this is a live region, so pay attention to updates and update the users as new content comes in here. So there's different ways of doing that, but it's important to keep in mind if you have dynamic content, make sure you alert the users that it's there. And what was that? Which one? The top one or bottom one?
Some text menu document page VOM button ID.
So I think, yeah, so right there, the button has nothing special, but on this right here, I added a ARIA Live polite on it. And so then it's just letting it know that, hey, there's some content. When this updates, let the user know that there's new content here, basically. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing with single page applications is page focus. You might want to handle that. Yeah, you probably should handle that because normally in a traditional website, you change the page, the whole page reloads, starts them back at the top. If it's a single page app, I might click the link, but my focus stays right on that link that I'm at. So you probably want to manage that focus to start back at the top. A lot of people I've seen have recommended just putting the focus back on the H1 of the page so that once the page changes. We're about out of time. Just kind of tables, same type of thing. There's tables that I could build a table using HTML tables, or I could use a bunch of divs. If I use an HTML table, then each column is associated with the headers of that table. If I use divs, there's no association, and so it's just a bunch of text that really means nothing associated together. So it's important to use tables rather than just divs. fixed dimensions could be dangerous if I change my settings. Let me turn off screen reader. I think we might be done with that. So fixed dimensions, if I change my settings, and this is something to keep in mind, people might change the settings of how big the font is. So you want to make sure your site is robust enough that it doesn't break if someone changes their default settings. And so you see right now, I have some fixed width and height around this, and now it's just cut off that content because I have changed my default font size. So that's something to keep in mind. People don't always, they're not going to always be using the default settings that you are using to view your website. So you want to make sure your site's robust enough to not break if that happens.
And so changing that default size, you said you bootstrap. Most of them ladies, they start out and they say, hey, my base font size is 14 pixels. And everything else is big buttons. If you change that default, it wouldn't really affect that. Is that the case like with Bootstrap right now, or have they changed that? They gave it off with an M or
so I'm not 100% sure on all of that. Have to get into a little bit more. I do know that, like with this same text right here, if I just zoom in, it doesn't actually break. But if I go change like the browser settings, then it will break. And so there are just some different things to keep in mind there. But yeah, I'm not sure on exactly that one. Another thing is focus indicators. If you notice that little orange square around the open button up there, now if I tab to these 4 buttons right here, I've removed that. So imagine if I'm using a keyboard and trying to use this web page, I have no idea what button has the focus. So if I activate that button, I have no idea of knowing which one has a focus. So focus indicator is key. Some designers hate it, how it looks. So that can be a problem. But you can customize that. So that can be kind of a compromise of allowing the designer to style that how they think it looks better. But those are important for accessibility reasons. Autoplaying content can be really bad for screen reader users. You can imagine if maybe I'll pull this up really quick just to show one last thing how bad some of these things can be. So there's a site, it's called Should I Use a Carousel?
Heading level 1, so should I use a carousel? Link, should I see carousel?
Okay, sorry, let me...
Heading left menu, should I use a carousel? Use a screen reader to listen to the following red Spanish.
What is going on?
Select thousand word.
Sorry.
Last button roulette. Should I use a carousel? Visited link, should I use a carousel? Heading level 1, so should I use a carousel? Link showbiasecarousel.com. Link showbiasecarousel.com. Link showbiasecarousel.com. Link showbiasecarousel.com. Link showbiasecarousel.com.
You can kind of get an idea that, I mean, you can build a carousel more accessible than this, but there can be some serious issues if you don't keep accessibility in mind. You can imagine there's some annoying things as like a lot of people for usability say carousels are annoying, they're pointless, but for accessibility, if you do it wrong, it can really mess up everything. It can make the web page really annoying or unusable. So I wanted to show that just because it can be really bad if you do some of this stuff incorrectly. And then, yeah, I think that's basically what I wanted to get to. There's one more part about form validation, just making sure that's all clear to your users. Why did something fail? Sometimes, a lot of times with like JavaScript frameworks, especially, a lot of times people will disable buttons so you can't submit a form. That can be hard for screen reader users as well, because you're trying to submit a form, you don't know why you can't submit it. There's no visual indicator that this is invalid. And so things like that to keep in mind. With form validation, it's usually considered maybe a better idea to just allow them to submit the form and then do proper validation after, say, hey, these are the things that you need to fix, and then easy ways for them to fix that. So.
Do you know which companies or institutes or government using
Using what?
Using the web access for the disability. Does it exist anywhere they are using right now? Which company is it?
Walmart.
Walmart?
The company has something to right now, and bringing Walmart on board in the
Because when I was working for the government, they don't use it so far as that other thing. Which they have to use.
Is it required?
Yeah, it should be a requirement for every government agency, should be making it accessible. There's different levels of how well different agencies are probably doing that. But yeah, it should be.
The only thing that I prefer for different languages and the color. That's it.
Yeah. And then there's a bunch of more. Okay, let me turn that off. There's a bunch of more resources I put in here. There's some checklists that can help you go through a lot of these guidelines. There's a meetup that just started in Salt Lake for web accessibility. They're going to be meeting July 31st is the next one. So if you go to Meetup, you can find them as well. There's a training that WebAIM does in Utah State. It's a 2-day training, like 8 hours each day or something. That's where I learned a lot of this stuff. I think it's a very beneficial training.
Are there third-party tools besides ARIA that you use on the development side?
On the development side?
Yeah, like, so ARIA is a development tool, right? And there's a lot of testing tools, but
yes.
Is there anything besides ARIA that you use?
So ARIA, yeah, the main purpose of that is to tell a screen reader what something is at the end of the day, like this div is actually a button and stuff like that. And so as far as that goes, as far as I know, the main things to keep in mind of stuff like ARIA is just using semantic HTML where possible is kind of the go-to. Just use the HTML elements, and then where you can't, then you can use ARIA to help with that. Above that, I don't really know of anything along those lines that could help for accessibility. There are some tools out there that will claim, like, add this JavaScript and we'll make your website accessible. Those usually, I think they don't work very well and are just to try to get people's money. But so there's things to keep in mind with stuff like that as well. There are some tools out there that may not be the best as well. That if it claims that we'll slap this on and make you accessible, it probably doesn't do that actually. So. But yeah, I don't know. Hope that helps a little bit, but okay. Any other questions before? Is there different support for that, are you saying? Yeah. So a lot of those, there are definitely extra considerations with a lot of those frameworks to keep in mind. A lot of like Angular, stuff like links and buttons, I mean, you can still use links and buttons and then just add your extra attributes to it, and that can help keep it accessible. There are definitely some that might make it more of a challenge. A lot of those frameworks will have guidelines for that as well, to be like, hey, to make this accessible, follow this. What do you have to say?
Especially the Angular one, if you just follow the standards we're talking about here, they can sort of thing. Although a lot of the frameworks coming in are, like especially Angular, those are actually integrating it into their own tags, their own code, so that in the future, you just do one and does it all for you, but for now, just follow the standards and it will get up for you.
Yeah. And then there is some further, I think I mentioned it somewhere in the WebAIM million section. It's interesting as far as frameworks go. I think this is a good, nice little read to look into. They detect, as part of their scan of the million websites, they try to detect like which websites, like if they detect Angular on it, is there generally more accessibility issues, less? And they did some of those stats. Not to say that any of these are better or worse for accessibility, but I think it's just insightful information. So I would recommend just kind of going through some of this, like use Squarespace. Sites that they detected Squarespace on had 45% less errors than the average site. Blogger had 237% more. And so it's just kind of interesting insights and stuff like, it's hard to compare because an Angular website is going to have a lot more dynamic functionality than just a static HTML, CSS site. And so it's going to have more accessibility issues, most likely. So it's not to say that Angular is inaccessible, but it can add extra complexity that can make your website inaccessible. I think important things to keep in mind as well. Right. Any other questions? Can we post like a link in the meetup?
I will figure that out.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm fine sharing these, and we'll figure out a way to do that. Okay. All right. That's all. Thank you.